Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks everyone for being interested in performance. As Tristan mentioned, come on, work for me. As Tristan mentioned, my name is Christian Bromann. Guten Abend allerseits, how we would say in Germany. I'm a software engineer here at the Task Labs. I do a lot of things besides leading the performance team. I'm open source maintainer of the WebDriver project, as you probably have heard about. I'm the AC rep for Task Labs at the W3C, so I'm sitting with the browser vendors together and think about the next version of the WebDriver protocol that you might all use with Selenium. And yeah, within the last year or so, I was really focused on building capabilities on top of WebDriver. Not only just functional testing, but also non-functional testing. And one of those things is, for instance, performance. And the reason why performance became really important to me was that I was thinking, like, how many people today use the internet? It's currently 50%. 50% of the human population is on the internet. The only 50% that don't have access, they will get access within the next 20 years or so. And they don't, those people, they usually come from countries that are, from the emerging markets that they don't have the latest feature phones, they don't have latest iPhones, the latest, Nexus, Galaxies. They come with something like a feature phone, as you can see here. Those feature phones are really cheap to create and productionize, and therefore also really cheap to sell. So you have here on your left side a geophone that runs Firefox OS, a fork of Firefox OS called Kiosk OS, which comes with a Firefox 43 or 44. And it gives these people that getting access for the first time to the internet, the ability to surf the web and serve, your services that you build in your companies. But if you think now, well, our target group, not the emerging market, this is not the whole story. If you see on the right, this is the Nexus 1. The Nexus 2 looks a little, the Nokia 2 looks a little bit more fancier. It looks like a real smartphone, but it's actually you can actually compare it to an iPhone that has been developed 7 years ago. So it has the same performance benchmarks and the same performance capabilities. And those kind of people, those kind of phones are subsidized and being given to almost no cost to people that live below the poverty line here in the United States, which is 16%, which is not a small number. So if your service wants to provide these people access to your services, if you want to be inclusive to those people, you have to make sure that your service is performant enough that these people don't just jump off your service. And it's really interesting, according to a couple of surveys, that people don't like slow internet sites. You see here that 53% of mobile page visits are abandoned if the page takes longer than 3 seconds to load. The average page size last year was 3 megabytes and will be this year likely around 4 megabytes. And the average page load size is 3.21 seconds. And you see that we put more and more stuff on the front end, and we need to make sure that what we do is still performant and still inclusive enough for people with low-end phones to be accessible and usable. Also, Google has their take on that. They say, how fast your website loads is critical, but often a complete ignored element in any online business, and that includes search marketing and search engine optimization. That means if the Google bot finds out that your page is actually loading slow, they will decrease your page rank. And with that, it starts with your customers leaving the page before you even provide your services to them, and it ends with your page not even being indexed by Google or being on the third page of the Google search engine. Performance matters. The hashtag perf matters is like a global movement of developers and companies all over the world that try to educate about performance, that try to provide workshops and provide tutorials about how you can improve the performance of your page. And here at SAUS, I wanted to join that movement because we think next to functional testing, non-functional testing and performance testing will be a critical part when those 50% of people that don't have access to the internet will have in the next 10 to 15 years. There was this American businessman, Harold Green. He lived in the 70s. He had no idea about the internet. The internet wasn't around at that time. So he had also no idea about web performance and web in general. But he said that. He said, performance stands out like a ton of diamonds, but non-performance can always be explained away. That means that apparently we really care about performance, and we should care about performance, but currently we don't really make sure that our performance is great. We don't really test about it. By show of hands, who of you has a performance test in their pipeline? Oh, a couple of people. That's cool. But I want to, actually, everyone should have that kind of performance step in their pipeline. And we want, before we start looking into how we actually can test performance, let's look into what performance actually means. Like, what can we measure and what can we assert against? Starting with something called time to first byte. Time to first byte is a really critical metric because it makes, it is the most critical part of the whole page load experience. If that metric is slow, everything else will be slow, and your whole experience will be not good. Time of first byte is the time when you put in a URL in your browser and you click enter and you hit enter until the server responds with the first byte to the browser. If your server is slow, like if the computation of the server takes a long time to provide the HTML page, your browser is sitting there doing nothing, and you sitting there doing nothing, and you don't know what's going on. So you need to make sure that the time of first byte is as fast as possible because it will defer all the upcoming metrics after that and will make the overall experience bad as well. Then we have a couple of rendering-related metrics. There's one, the FirstPaint. FirstPaint is pretty much whenever the browser started drawing something on the page. That is usually a background, a background image, or a gradient or a background color. Then after a while, after the browser starts parsing the CSS, starts parsing the HTML, he will display some first elements from the DOM. At that point, we can call the first contentful paint. Then a while, nothing happens until most of the page is drawn, and the user can start consuming the content, and that we call the largest contentful paint. And at the end of the day, the user wants to use the website, but if the browser is still busy working on the JavaScript and rendering the stuff that you want to show, it cannot be used because we just have one thread and everything will be slow and janky. And once the browser has finished everything from the computation side, we call that the time to interactive. Another metric that's pretty interesting is called speed index. It was created by the guys from WebPageTest.org. It pretty much gives you an indication on how quickly the content has been appeared on the page. We have here two examples. One is an optimized page that uses progressive rendering, and the other one is unoptimized. And you see that on the progressive rendering example, that we have a lot of content shown while the browser is parsing the DOM and parsing the CSS. And the colored area on top you see shows like how much has been rendered already. So they compare the images during the page load to find out how much the browser has been progressed in rendering the page. And in the lower part, you see nothing happens for a while until the whole page shows up. And obviously, the optimized website provides a better user experience than the non-optimized website. And speed index is being calculated by measuring the white area in this graph. So if the speed index is low, the user experience is actually pretty good. So we can sum this up by putting all these metrics into 3 buckets. We have the milestone-related metrics that are somehow connected to a time duration. We have the score-based metrics. You probably heard about the Lighthouse performance score. There are other ways of creating a score for specific varieties of metrics. And at the end, we have resource-based metrics. For instance, if you want to make sure that you don't let the user download more than 250 kilobytes of JavaScript or CSS. And you might think yourself, are all these metrics even important to me? There are a lot of metrics. Should I all test against them? And the answer is yes. Like, if you say my app loads in in 5 seconds. Or if you say my app loads fast. Fast is somehow a vague term. What does fast even mean? So you really have to look into the user experience. You really have to check how is the user experience the page. And to answer that, some smart folks at Google tried to map the metrics that I just explained to some sort of user experience. They ask questions like, is something happening on the page? So is the browser responding? Is something happening? And you can answer that with looking at the time to first byte metrics, right? Then you would look like, or you would ask yourself, is it useful what I see? Can I consume the content? Can I start, reading text or anything? And you can, measure that by time to first meaningful paint. Then you will ask yourself, is it usable what I see? Can I actually interact with the page? You would call that, or you would look, to answer that, you would look into the time to interactive. And last but not least, you would ask yourself, is it actually delightful what I see? Like, is it really smooth, the behavior? Does it have any jank, which I come to later at the talk? And you look, for that to answer, you look into how the browser computes the JavaScript. Are there a lot of blocking tasks that the browser has to do? Are there frames being dropped? Things like that. And you compare that to the idea of, think about you would go with your partner to a restaurant, right? You would go in there, you would sit at a table, and you would have to wait an hour until the waiter comes and he brings you the menu, then you order, then after 5 seconds he comes back, gives you the food, including the check, and asks you to leave. This would be not a nice experience. You would probably never go back to this restaurant again. On the other side, think about you would go to a restaurant and then the waiter comes right away and he would give you something to drink first, and then you start with the entries. Then he asks you what's your main dish like. Then you eat the main dish, and then you come to the desserts. And overall you start consuming things and you're never bored, or you never wait. It's a much better experience than waiting for an hour and then get everything at the same time. There are two different kinds of experience here. I also heard this report of the Houston airport where a lot of customers apparently complained that they had to wait too long for their bags to show up at the conveyor belt, right? So it was a bad experience for the airport, for the customers at this airport. So what they did, instead of speeding up the time until the bags arrive at the conveyor belt, they let the people just walk a longer way to this conveyor belt. And everyone was happy with that. No complaints at that point anymore. So what I want to say with that is fast forward to today, and that is a quote from Steve Souders, who's one of the experts in the performance area. Fast forward to today, we see that the window on load event doesn't reflect the user experience as it did once. If you say, my page loads in 5 seconds, or my page loads fast, this is technically correct, but it doesn't really reflect the user experience. You need to understand how the user experience, how this whole page load happened for the user, and how he experienced it, and you want to test that. So before we go into that, we have to understand how the browser actually, experienced the page load. And to do that, we have to look into what browser tracing means. Have any one of you have heard about browser tracing? Have everyone used this kind of performance tab before? You go there, you record something, and you see this nice flame chart with all these things that happen during the time where you record the browser. And what happens here is that you start collecting log events from the browser that come internally from the Chrome engine and browser engine. And those events are normal log events that are from type JSON. These so-called trace logs have a specific name. They are connected to a specific category. They are from a specific type. There are begin and end events to say this task began there, this task ended there. There are complete events, instance events. You can read about all these events in the trace event format, which is pretty comprehensive. So there's this huge stack of logs that the browser is collecting. Sometimes, depending on how long you trace the browser, it can be multiple megabytes of size. And you would never actually dig into those logs with your IDE or text editor because it would be too much information. So in order to give you value out of these trace logs, the browser vendors started to help you to understand what happened behind the scenes. We have here an example about a graph that is shown in the Performance tab that gives you an indication of how big was the heap size during the page load or during this trace duration, how many documents were loaded, how many nodes were in the DOM, and how many listeners were registered. And this whole graph is just based on this one single trace event called update counters. There are multiple of these update counters event in the trace log, and based on that, the DevTools application can create this kind of graph. Another interesting example is the screenshots that you see if you trace the browser. This is also just a trace event which has the name screenshot and is in the category disabled by default, DevTools screenshot. The reason why it is prefixed with disabled by default is that some of those trace events, if you want to capture them, they take some performance impact on your browser. But usually that doesn't have a big impact on the user experience in general. And in regards to performance, Google also built and provides excellent tools to measure and use those trace logs to get an idea about the performance and the user experience during the page load. You probably have heard about Google Lighthouse, which is an excellent tool to get diagnostics about the page load and what you can do to improve the page load overall. Another example is WebPageTest. They run a page load for you, and they use a trace log to give you all the information about the network, about JavaScript errors, about what happens, all the metrics that are collected, and you can get a nice indication about what happened during the page load. The problem that I have with these tools is that they don't really fit, they don't really tell the whole story. Knowing about one single page load of your application is good. It's a good first start. But I want to know, a lot of customers want to know what is the performance experience from the beginning of when the user enters my application till he checks out, he buys an item or something like that. I want that my page load or all the page load during that time are good and consistent. So these tools doesn't really provide that. And I was thinking, well, how can I get these additional information? And obviously, as someone who has been working in the automation space for a while, I was like, why can't we use WebDriver for it? WebDriver is an excellent protocol to automate browsers in a varieties of ways. Why we can't just do performance testing with WebDriver? So before I get into that, let's do a little bit recap of what WebDriver is, because I see a lot of people getting confused about Selenium and WebDriver and what's the difference and what has Cypress to do with it. So let me recap that. WebDriver is a protocol that defines a REST API service, pretty much. So it is a server that implements a variety of endpoints, and every endpoint can trigger an action in the browser. So if you call /session with a post method, you get a browser. If you call /click on an element, it clicks on that element. And all this protocol is doing is defining these automation steps. And whoever is implementing that should do these automation in the browser, should do this action in the browser. And the way it is usually set up in your environment or in arbitrary environments is that you have a test script written with a tool like Selenium or WebDriver.io. And those services or those tools, frameworks, they do these HTTP requests to this REST service, which in this case is a browser driver. Every browser vendor has a driver and comes with a driver. We have Chrome that provides a Chrome driver. We have Firefox provides a Gecko driver, and so on. And every browser vendor that takes part into the W3C standardization process has to provide those kind of drivers to make sure that we are able to test cross-browser. And these drivers, they take this HTTP request, and they are connected with the browser in a way that allows them to do these kind of automations. If you see on the top right, we have Puppeteer and Cypress, who are connected to the browser interfaces, which is the reason why they only can, for instance, automate Chrome. So the value proposition of Sauce Labs is kind of obvious in that sense, right? You know, to automate the browser, you have to download the browser driver. You have to set up a browser. For mobile, it's even more difficult because there are so many possibilities how you can set up a mobile device in your cloud. It's really difficult to set it up. And for Sauce, if you use Sauce Labs, it's kind of obvious because we provide you one endpoint and provide you all the devices and browsers that you need for your testing purposes. And on top of that, we create and capture a lot of assets, not only video, not only logs. We started to provide you with performance capabilities to give you an idea to how your performance of a page load looks like, as well as how the general performance of your application is. So why is Sauce Labs interesting in performance? Well, we are behind the idea of shift testing to the left. And like I said, all these tools that we currently have with Lighthouse, with WebPageTest.org, they are great, but they're really difficult to set up in a CI/CD pipeline. And we have all these browsers already. We can automate them in any way that we want. So we can provide you a really easy interface to run these performance tests and to champion performance testing in general. And we looked at the landscape, what we have. I already told you about Lighthouse and Chrome DevTools. There are tools that are really great to test the performance in the lab. And on the production side, you have then tools like New Relic, where they capture real user metrics, and SpeedCurve does the same. You inject this little script, and the script captures the metrics that can be captured using the JavaScript APIs today. And they're really good by they look really into what your users like. They capture all the data that your users have and the devices that your user actually use, and give you an indication about what kind of page loads your users have experienced. But I don't see currently any tool that is in the middle of that, like any tool that helps you to transition from the lab, from your development circle to production. Like, there's no tool that helps you to actually test the performance in an efficient manner. And to make it really simple, we created a tool called Speedo. Speedo is our open source tool. You can look it up on GitHub. It is open source. It uses the Sauce Labs APIs. It creates a job with WebDriver, and it makes it really easy for you to run automated performance tests without knowing about Selenium, without knowing about WebDriver, without knowing about where the browser is running, without taking care of where to store my data. It is all in one, and you can use it to get started with performance testing. The way how you start is just install it with NPM. It's an NPM tool. You can also download the Docker image and run it via Docker. And you just call Speedo run and give your URL. And what Speedo is doing is it creates a baseline. So we find out what's the usual performance of your application looks like. And then we run the performance test against it. And we trace the browser. We use Lighthouse to capture all the metrics. And then we compare the page load metrics with all the results that we had and we have seen in the past. So we don't really care about if your page loads 5 seconds or in 10 seconds. We are really looking into how the page load has changed over time. And you can see here, at the end of the day, you get performance results. Per default, you test against the performance Lighthouse score. But you can really use all the other metrics that I've shown you a second ago. If you're, for instance, an e-commerce company, you're really interested in when the user sees the search bar to start interacting with your service and to start looking for a product. You can look, you can use the time to first, what is it? FirstPaint. You can use the FirstPaint metric to really find out how quick your service actually returns a user that kind of search bar. And at the end of the day, you have some runtime settings, and you get the link to the Sauce Labs job as well as the Lighthouse performance score. So let's actually look into that. I hope my app is still up. Good job, Sean. So I built a little application here. It's Tony's favorite food. It's a small React application, that shows Tony's favorite food. And I've been running a couple of performance tests in here, as you can see here. And now I want to make some changes to it to decrease the performance of that app. And in order to do that, I look into what I have here. So this is my Webpack config. Let's put in the development mode so that my assets are not being minified. Then let's go up. What do we have here? I think it's enough to just start mining Bitcoin, because we all know that the crypto scene is currently really hot, or it will become hot. So let's start mining Bitcoin. And I hope my app will be up in a second. So with the mining Bitcoin app function, I pretty much block the main thread for 3.5 seconds. And that will decrease the performance tremendously. Before I move on, unfortunately it takes today a lot of time until this is being up. But I can show you what Speedo is doing. So what you see here is it starts a performance test. It runs it automatically for you. It finds out your credentials if you have that exported in your environment. It waits for the job to finish. It downloads all the performance assets that we capture for you, so you can store it in your CI/CD environment. Like here in this folder, it gives you an overview about all the performance metrics that have been captured for the page that has a good performance. So we here have a Lighthouse score of 96%. That is a passing job. You see the environment of this test. So we always, or per default, Speedo throttles the test to emulate an iPhone with a good 3G connection. Mobile phones are usually a little bit slower, so we throttle the CPU as well. And we also emulate a mobile environment. So you can see here the user agent is actually Safari. And as you can see in the top, I set Speedo to emulate an iPhone 10. And what you get at the end is a link to the job details page, as well as the Lighthouse report that gives you an idea what you can make to improve the performance of your app. And it seems that my app is loaded. So I will just run the same test again. So my Source Labs credentials are stored in the environment. And now the test is running again. In the meantime, I can show you the job details page. You see all the tests that have been running before. And they're, as I've mentioned before, we try to capture and get an idea about how the performance looks like in the past. And based on that, we create a baseline that defines the lower bound and the upper bound. And if the test is about to pass or should pass, we expect your metrics to be in the middle of that. Of course, if you have, if your metrics vary a lot, then we increase that baseline, and this idea of asserting against it doesn't become really useful anymore, because if you test, if you expect your time to first byte to be within 2 or 10 seconds, it doesn't really matter at this point. But you can then still return or download these metrics and have a hard assertion against it. What you can see here also is the screenshots, how this page has been built up, and the idea about how much script was executed, how many documents were downloaded, how big are the images. So let's check our test, and our test failed in that sense. Our score is only 82, and we were expecting a score between 93 and 98. We can go into the job details page again. And we see that our score dropped because the first contentful band increased because the mining Bitcoin was blocking the main thread and was not allowing the browser to do anything else besides mining Bitcoin in that time. And you see all the metrics. It's the same that I said before with time of first byte. All the metrics have been shifted to the right and have become slower. And you can see here everything started after 3 seconds, and that let your data spike over time and let Speedo fail at the end. So Speedo is a really simple tool to get started with performance testing. Just download it and run a performance test just like that. those tests run in source apps. You don't need to set up anything. You just do npm install, and it runs on our cloud. So no need to set up a Docker container where Lighthouse is running, or where you have a Chrome instance. Everything is running on our cloud. And
what if you want to run it against a local instance of a web page that's like on the local VM environment?
you specify a source connect tunnel ID, and
What if I don't want to? Do I have to?
That sounds like a question that needs a microphone.
Yeah, what if I don't want to run it through sauce? I want to run it everything locally. Can I download it and run it all locally?
it has to run on our cloud, because we need to make sure that the environment where you run your performance test in is the same at all time. And our cloud has not 100%, but almost always the same performance capabilities. If you run your performance test on your local machine, it will be always faster, because your local machine, your MacBook, will be faster than our VM in our cloud. So by running everything in our cloud, we always have the same performance benchmark at all times, and we can identify if there's a performance hiccup or not.
Right, I was thinking more of running in a CI system like Jenkins, so it's on a Google or AWS machine.
Sure. So if your page is located locally in your network, you use Source Connect. With Speedo, you can just provide a Source Connect identifier. It starts Source Connect for you, and you can access a localhost site that you have, or a site that is running in your network, just like that. And you might ask yourself now, well, this is not any different than Lighthouse, but without setting up the browser. And that is right. But we also capture performance for any page transition that happens. So not only you provide an URL and we capture the performance for that, every time you click on a link, every time you submit this formula, we capture the performance for that page transition as well, even in React application where there is not actually a page transitioning happening. You can use Speedo for that here too. So we have here a test that runs the WebDriver, that is a WebDriver script, and it logs in into an Instagram account in that sense. So it puts in the credentials, and then it submits, clicks on the submit button, and we capture the performance for not only visiting Instagram.com, but also for the time that takes from clicking on the submit button until the feed actually has been shown. And by providing a Docker image for you, we make it also really easy to hook Speedo into a CI/CD system using Jenkins or GitLab, where you just need to define the Docker image, and then you have Speedo at your utility belt. You just export your Source Labs credentials into the environment, and you can say Speedo run there as well. And as I mentioned before, we capture the performance of every page transitions, and we extended the WebDriver protocol in a way that we always listen to what you are actually doing in your test. So when you click on the link, we don't send the click right away. We start tracing the browser first. And then we wrap up the performance testing before you can continue with the next command. And in order to, for you, if you don't want to use Speedo and if you want to build your own test framework, you can use that as well by using our WebDriver extensions to assert the performance baseline. There's this command called assert performance in Selenium, or you would need to hit this REST endpoint. But if you use, for instance, in WebDriver.io, I already created a command in that framework where you just need to say browser.assertPerformance. You provide the test name, and you specify the metrics you are interested in. And it will assert your page load performance against the baseline that we have captured before. But you can you can use any framework that exists using WebDriver, for instance, Selenium and Python, and use our executor, a JavaScript executor workaround. So it's available everywhere with any framework that you use today. And like I said, we not only capture page loads, we also capture page load performance. Here's an interesting example from Postmates.com, where I hit int, where I try to find food in the San Francisco area. And with a simple script, I can follow along the user journey from finding the city until selecting food. and going to the checkout. And even though this is a React application where no page load actually happens because it's React, it's no new page is being loaded, we still capture the performance of that page. I have an example for that here. So you see here, I open postmates.com. The page has been loaded from there to there. This is a first page load. Then we go one further where we are at the feed. And here we have been entered San Francisco as a city. It's a little bit small to see, but you get the idea. And so I hit enter to find, that is the next page transition from entering San Francisco, California, hitting enter to watching the feed. So I hit look for San Francisco, and the page builds up the feed for all the food restaurants in San Francisco. Next one is where I actually see all the food restaurants in San Francisco, and then I select the first one, which is Jin, like a Korean place. I capture the performance for that. The next one, it's hard to see, I think, because the images are not captured, but I select the first food item. And the last one is I go to the checkout. Yeah. Huh? The food was excellent. But I was running the test a couple of times, so it was pretty heavy on my credit card. Anyway, you see we capture the performance for all these page transitions over time, and you can make sure that the whole checkout process is performant in any way. Before we wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about jankiness. Because page loading is not the only area where bad performance can decrease the user experience of a page. It's also when users interact with it. Once the page is loaded and the user starts scrolling around, entering something, looking at anything, if the page is laggy, if the page loses frames, that is also a bad experience. And we wanted to do something against that, or we wanted to provide you ability to do something against that as well. And the reason why this is a more problematic concern is that we are putting more and more JavaScript onto the browser. As you can see here in this chart, the amount of JavaScript we put in our pages today has been, is like 5 times as much as it was 9 years ago. And it's not only our own script, it is much more all these trackers, all the analytics scripts that we put on our page. They just create a huge amount of JavaScript that has to be downloaded and has to be executed in our application, in our service. And JavaScript makes a lot of execution time in our browsers. And remember, we only have one thread, and we always have one thread in our browser. That means if we execute too much JavaScript, we lose frames. That means that the user cannot do anything. It cannot interact with any element. It doesn't see a hover or whatever. So it's really critical of how much JavaScript can we execute and how it impacts the user experience overall. And for users, I call this jank, which is like kind of the term how you can describe that. And jank is like any stuttering or juddering or just plain halting that users see when a site or app isn't keeping up with the refresh rate. We want to have those 60 frames per second to make the experience of interacting with the page really smooth and excellent. And the solution for that, and how we thought that would be good to test that, is we provide a command for you that interacts with the page, and we capture all the information metrics or different kind of performance metrics in order to allow you to make a judgment about the performance of the page. So in this sense, we interact with it by scrolling from the top to the bottom of the page. That easy. It takes 5 seconds. Like we have this script that scrolls from the top to the bottom in 5 seconds, and we capture what happens in between. And we look especially what's the average FPS number is, so how many frames per second your service has delivered. We look into how much was the browser busy rendering and scripting and doing something versus just staying idle and doing nothing. And we also look into the memory usage as well as how much you force your application or the browser to restyle and recalculate the layout of elements. And at the end of the day, we create 4 scores of that that are between 0 and 1. And we provide you an overall score, I think here, that you can use to assert. And that score gives you the ability to have an idea how smooth the application actually behaved. And we're getting pretty good in keeping the score as more you test, as closer to reality as possible. Okay, let's wrap up. What we have seen, we have learned what kind of performance metrics there exist. We learned how the browser experienced the metrics, and we learned how we can test against the metrics. So let me wrap up with some of the best practices that we have experienced so far that you should do and you should care about. First off, functional and performance testing are 2 separate kind of things. You don't want to do the same kind of testing in a single test. So in the testing pyramid, you can think about unit tests at the bottom, integration tests in the middle, then you have some end-to-end tests on the top. And the performance tests are like the sprinkle on the top. So just have a couple of performance tests for pages that are really crucial for your users, that are the entry points for users and your service, and just test these. Don't care about all the pages that you provide. Just care about the main user flows that how your users use your application. Next is don't worry about other browsers and versions too much. Where in functional testing, it's definitely important to have some sort of cross-browser test, at least in Chrome, Firefox, maybe some mobile applications. For performance, it's not that problematic because browsers have pretty good benchmark tests, and every browser release is well tested in terms of performance. So the metrics actually stay pretty much the same over a variety of browser versions. So if you test performance, just use the latest Chrome, which is always provides you the best experience for that. Then keep it simple. Like I said, just test the really important pages that your users are using. And if you test performance on Source Labs, have one single job name for one performance test. In order for us to allow us to make sense of the old page load that happened in the past, it is important for us that we have a test name that we can use to identify all your previous performance tests. And at the end of the day, kind of know what you want to test. If you're an e-commerce page, you want to make sure that the search bar is shown as quickly as possible. So you want to use something like the time of first paint as a metric, as an indicator for performance. If you just want to have a general idea about the performance, the Lighthouse performance score is excellent. But there are scenarios where other metrics come in and are important as well. With that said, thanks you for listening. I hope everything makes sense that I said. Yeah, thank you.
Can we get a standing ovation? Can we, come on, stand up, stand up. Yes, yes, yes. We are here on a Thursday. Thank you. Y'all, it is such a pleasure to have someone who literally is a living legend, who gives so much back, not just to our community, to the open source community. I really, really appreciate everything that you're doing here. And I want to take a quick moment before we get into questions to say, Christian, hello. How are you? Hi. Yeah. This outfit is everything. Can I get a round of applause for this outfit? It takes a real man to show up in an outfit when it's not Halloween. And I'm here for it. I'm here for it. I want to go back to part of your presentation. We talked about Cypress, we talked about Selenium, we talked about WebDriver. I want to talk about open source. A lot of people here may or may not be new to the industry. How did you fall into the open source community, and what inspired you to give back to the open source community?
I started with it in university, where we had, we had to build an application that we need to test. It was a backbone application, and there was not really a possibility to use unit tests to test those kind of applications. So I was looking for a way to automate a browser to click around my application, and there was nothing besides this one tool that was called WebDriver, and I started using it, and there were some problems with it that I wanted to fix. And since then, I started to work on that project, and it was always delightful because you can collaborate with people, you meet new people, and you can help out people and make an impact there. So.
And what do you feel like, and this is really helpful, and we're going to dive into questions because we see you all, and we're going to get to you. For you, what inspired you specifically to give back, and how did that motivate you? Did it motivate you in your everyday workflow?
I mean, yeah, you work on this project, and you see that it's being picked up, that it's being used by people, that people like it, and it's just a nice thing that people use your stuff, which is usually not common, and they like it, and you become friends. Like, I made a lot of friends just being an open source advocate, and that's something that I want to continue to do.
And you are a bit of a celebrity.
I'm not.
No, let's be real clear.
There are other people that are celebrity.
Yeah, well, it's cute, but you are.
I'm just pressing buttons on a gray machine, so that cannot be.
I hear you, and I hear you. Mm-hmm. What's the funniest story you've ever had where someone has recognized you, whether online or not?
I was this year in India, and you said people recognize you. So I went to the mall next to the conference and wanted to shop something, and there was someone from India wanted to take a picture for me, but not because I was famous, just because I'm white. That was so much to be a celebrity, right?
We'll unpack that later. We hear you. We hear you. I want to talk a little bit more also too about why is front end. I mean, like, so we have this. This is going to be all over YouTube. Okay, shocking. Oh my God, Jesus has nothing to do with this. Okay, we love you. Hallelujah. What for you? I'm sorry. I come from a very religious background, so apologies. I want to hear from you, though, so for someone who is new to front-end test performance, like what is a key takeaway? Like, what do you want people, after this incredible presentation, what do you want people to take away from this talk?
So I knew when we started looking into performance that it's currently really difficult. I mean, we have these excellent tools like Lighthouse, but it still takes a lot of work to set it up in a CI/CD environment. Sure. And it does not do the job of giving you the metrics over time. It does not give you the job of allowing you to assert against it. So you have to do a lot of things around to achieve that. And I wanted to make it simple, just like spin up something and it runs. And the advice I would give away is just start with Speedo, start with one single page, your main page, hellofresh.com, whatever you have. And you test the performance. You have Speedo running, and you don't need to care about where you store your data because that's all taken care by us, and it's an easy entry.
It's super, super helpful. What's been your biggest challenge with this project?
The biggest challenge is that we currently support this only in Chrome. We're rolling it out for mobile as well at some point. The biggest challenge is Chrome updates, because they don't tell you what has changed in Chrome. And we are pretty deep connected into the Chrome engine in Lighthouse and what the trace logs return you. Sure. And so from one version, like from Chrome 78 to 79, there can be a bug or there can be a problem that we have to take care of, or we have to fix in our system. And it forced me to look into the Chromium code, into Chrome driver, which has been challenging, but we have kind of mastered it, or we went ahead of it.
And I love this. As someone who runs our online customer community, secret sauce. Oh, how'd that happen? Oh, it's right here. Oh my God. Ooh. What's one What's one piece of feedback that you would give to our up-and-coming developers that are our customers and or QA testers that are seeking the next step and are looking to develop their skills? What's one piece of feedback that you would give them as someone who's had an incredible professional journey like your own?
Well, there are a lot of workshops, as Angie Jones said yesterday. There are so many workshops, Test Automation University, things like that, where you can just pick up really simple classes that help you to make your way to a professional automation expert or any kind of developer, because it's not only about automation, front end as well. Like there are so many front end courses that are free. It just needs interest, right? You just need to be interested and passionate about that, and then everything will come by itself.
I love this. Y'all, we're about to open up to some questions. Who has questions? Yes, right in the front. Who are you?
Hey, my name is Sebastian. You have a great outfit.
Bye.
Yeah. I actually have like a, I'm not sure, it's really not, it's related but not related in a way. Like, what do you think about AMP? Accelerated Mobile Pages. I was always kind of, I don't like it, but I want to hear your opinion.
EMP, you mean, yeah, so those are just pages built with specific standards in mind. I think they're great. It's a step for us, for the web platform, to bring web content to a native environment where you can use native application like Contact, Picker, and things like that. And it allows us in the web platform to work together with the mobile vendors to provide these capabilities to pick the contacts, to do phone calls on the web and things like that, and have like a native experience for web application, which I find great. And those are, you can test that with performance because it's at the end a web environment. And
oh, one more time.
Oh yeah. Well, what I said was like I thought it was primarily motivated by performance. I mean, that's what they're claiming, but
the way how you build those kind of application are with performance in mind. Like you create a manifest to provide offline first experience, so you cache a lot of things, and it helps you definitely to provide a much better performant page than just a normal web application.
I am here for these questions. We have more. Yes, Federico in the back.
This is Federico. I wanted to check if I understood well. Can I use Speedo without a SourceLab account, or?
You can't. However, I have something like Speedo is the tool that makes it simple for running things in Sauce. I moved almost the same code, but in a little different way, into a WebDriver I/O service that is called DevTools. If you use the DevTools service, it's pretty much just, the service is a plugin in WebDriver framework. You put it into your config, and it provides you with a couple of additional commands that allows you to do performance testing as well without having to use Sauce. So if you put the Sauce service in your configuration, you install it, you put it into your configuration as a service in your WDR-conf, and that adds a couple of commands to your browser instance. For instance, enable performance audits. You can even say, I want to emulate an iPhone 10, as I mentioned, as I showed in the demo. And then once you call this command, every page transition, similar to what I showed before, is also captured and stored, so you can assert against it. As you can see here, I open json.org, I get the metrics, and I can then assert against the speed index. But this is, with this way, you have to store all the data, you have to store all the metrics, but it's this open source solution to what I showed with Speedo.
Okay, can I continue? Another question is, you mentioned that there are many metrics that you can get from this interface. Do you have any set of basic metrics that are more important than, because there are a lot. If you provide the same amount of metrics that you can get from Lighthouse.
Yeah, so we can look into the metrics that we have and collect.
We could do this all day.
So this is like the set of metrics that are the most important ones. It starts with estimated input latency. That means like what are the longest blocking tasks? Like what are the time the browser was busy doing stuff without you getting to do anything? And then time to first byte, DOM content loaded, first visual change, last visual change. And I would say the most important one is the Lighthouse performance score that we provide for you. It is a weighted mean because between a couple of metrics that we provide you there. And it's kind of like built by Google or defined by Google and reflects the general user experience of a page load. Like they take into account the time of first byte, the blocking tasks in the browser, some rendering metrics, and they weight it based on the importance. And it gives you a good score of the general idea.
Can we just take a quick moment before we go to the next question? So I want to hear a little bit more. What is the history for all of our American viewers about Lederhosen?
How do I know? I'm not from Munich.
No.
This guy could.
Something. Can I get some history? We want a little bit of historical context about Lederhosen. I'm so sorry. Non-technical question.
Lederhosen. Okay. I'm trying to make up a really funny story, but I'm trying.
Make it up.
We were thought leaders in terms of clothing lines and all this stuff.
Lederhosen and computing are basically going hand in hand with one another. The greatest computer scientists, wear Lederhosen. No, I'm kidding. No, I think back in the part of the world where I grew up, close to the Alps, that's what they wore because it's sturdy, it keeps you warm. You basically don't ever really need to change. It fits every occasion. And you have a little pocket for your knife, which, we took out tonight because, we're not trying to scare anybody.
One thing about these, like, you never wash them. So I've been with these to a couple of Oktoberfest, and there are a couple of beer stands on this. There might be blood stands, but it could be ketchup as well. So.
I'm trying to encourage them to come back, not scare them.
Okay.
Y'all, I love this so much. More questions. So hard pivot from Bloodstains. YouTube, we're so sorry. We love you so much. More questions. Here we have another one.
Yes, I was just wondering if can you measure the performance of something not like a page load, like if you open up a popover or something and you're waiting for like an async call to come back and fill that?
Yes, you can do that. It's a question what you want to measure, right? So do you want to measure the first paint of that model? That is possible. We currently provide that if opening the model changes the URL. That's our way to identify, okay, this is something is changing, we have to measure that. If the page load doesn't open a new, or it doesn't change the URL history, we currently don't capture that. You can technically, of course, you have all the tracing logs that give you an indication what happens in between, but we haven't defined good metrics yet that would give you an idea about how quickly this model comes up. But it's possible because you know what has been rendered, you know pretty much everything that's going on in the browser. Yeah, you just need to find out which metrics or what you can measure that really reflects the user experience at the end of the day.
And when you were doing the jankiness test, you had some kind of percentage, or not percentage, but the decimal. Is that like a percentage?
Yes, that's a percentage. So we. So yeah, we oriented ourselves to the Lighthouse performance score, which is like a score percent value. So all these values here are in percent, and they are between 0 and 1. And I guess that's a good way to create some sort of score value.
So how do you measure the jankiness? I mean, is it like how fast how many frames per second the page is?
It's a majority. So as I said, from those 4 general scores that we create a weighted mean. That means that we say, okay, the FPS score for us is the most important indication of whether or not something is janky or not. Because if your FPS score is at around 20, it is this indication for it's kind of a janky page because it should be around 60. It's the same for the other scores, but for instance, the memory usage, depending on your device that you use, for an old like feature phone, as I mentioned before, it's more important, but for usually it doesn't impact the performance as much as the FPS score does. And in fact, the FPS score somehow reflects bad memory consumption as well.
And I think we're going to continue this conversation during our networking hour. We have time for one more question before the music plays. Y'all, this is literally a living legend. Can I get another round of applause? This is a big deal. This is a big deal. We have time for one more question in the back. Yes, yes, yes.
Hi, I have a question about, is it possible to use this performance test in iframe? Because our product is basically based on an iframe. A third-party website used us as an SDK, and then we imported our contents in their iframe.
Are you responsible for the parent frame?
Well, no, because we are just a provider, a service layer.
So what I would recommend in that scenario is that in your automation test, you open the URL of the iframe and test that performance.
Okay, got it. Yep, thanks.
Nothing else? Yep, pretty good. All right, y'all. We're about to make this music play. We're about to have some more partying. We're about to have some more festive situations. This is November Fest after all, y'all, okay? So we made it a thing. Please remember, we've got Bavarian beers on ice. Remember that Movember is a real issue that we care near and dear to our heart. So please, 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 if you're feeling inspired after today's conversation, please make a donation and improve the lives of men all over the world. Christian will be here in his Lederhosen. Let's have some fun. Let's connect. Let's build community. And don't forget that Andrew Kennedy over here will be doing a meetup here at Sauce Labs on December 11th. All right, y'all? Let's give a round of applause for Christian.
Thank you.